So good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. It is a little bit different from our usual Startup Grind event with COVID. So we are not hosting in person this time, obviously, but we are super happy that we have the opportunity to have Levi and Nathan with us from Partly, who are based in Christchurch. So my name is Rosie. I'm the founder of Our Closet, an online marketplace for the rental and resale of personal goods. And then we have Sinead, who has experience building teams for a number of successful high-growth startups around the world, and is now working day-to-day at Talent Army in Auckland.
Cool, thanks, Rosie. So for those of you who are joining virtually now and have never been to a Startup Grind event before, I'll give you a bit of a rundown. So Startup Grind's actually founded by Google. Startup Grind's, I think it's the world's largest startup community. So we've got about 600 chapters in over 125 countries. So this is the only one actually in New Zealand at the moment. And the goal is to educate, inspire, and connect entrepreneurs all over the world. So we typically host monthly events or every 6 to 8 weeks, featuring successful founders, innovators, educators, and investors to share their personal stories and lessons learned on the road to building the great companies that they're building.
Okay. So let's get started with our fireside chat. So how this works, we start with a few questions from us. Because we are online, do please pop your questions into the Q&A box. That's different than the chat box. That just makes it a little bit easier for us to manage as we go. And I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions, so pop them in there. So to give a bit of context for our guests this afternoon, Partly is a Christchurch-based software company offering an easy system for people to buy and sell car parts. Partly is essentially a data company that builds tools and data sets to connect buyers and sellers in the car parts industry. They've taken hundreds of millions of parts from across millions of vehicles and brought them together in one common platform. And they have recently achieved the largest pre-Series A valuation for a startup in New Zealand history. And their most recent round of capital raising added an extra $3.7 million in venture capital funding led by Australasian VC fund Blackbird Ventures. Other notable investors include the founder of Figma and Fawcett's former boss, Peter Beck, founder of Rocketlab. So let's dive into Levi and Nathan's journey.
Cool, excited to have you both here. So a bit of a tradition, the way we kind of like to kick things off is taking things all the way back to your childhood and upbringing. Sorry, there's a dog barking in the background. So the first question is, where are you from and what were your interests growing up and what do you want to be? What did you want to be when you were little? I know there's a few in there, but try and answer it as best you can.
Interesting. Maybe I'll start this one off. So I was born in Nelson in the South Island, but moved to Christchurch when I was pretty young, about 5. When I was younger, I wanted to be an engineer. So I had pretty clear direction from very, very young. And that never really changed right the way through my life. I kind of went between different types of engineering, but ended up landing in engineering. Nathan.
I'm surprised that you stopped there. I mean, I think out of anyone, we've probably had the longest history from childhood. I was born in Auckland originally, but also grew up in North Canterbury. Both Levi and I have known each other for a very long time, probably since around about 6 or 7 years old. We were both homeschooled, so we had known each other, throughout the homeschooling community. I would often travel across to Levi's house on Wednesdays, and we would do what you might call practical learning, which was mostly consisted of Levi building go-karts and myself watching and trying to help where I could. It probably wasn't very much help at the time. So my early memories of Levi and hanging out has always been very practical, very hands-on. Levi is probably too humble to admit much of this, but he had a little business, fixing machinery for the neighbors from a very young age, fixing people's iPods or laptops or any sort of electronics. We would bring them to Levi, and that's where most of my pocket money went at the time, was passing it on to Levi to try and build myself some engines and things like that. So that was a very practical education from very young age, and we've known each other since that time. What I wanted to do when I grew up was probably less clear. I think I jumped around from multiple things year on year, from fireman to digger and truck driver, probably from the youngest of ages. So less of a clear direction than Levi there, but yeah.
Cool. Oh wow, that's super interesting. And look where you two are now, from fixing the neighbor's lawnmower.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit about your previous work experience to starting Partly? And maybe that will bring us through to how you came up with the idea to start Partly.
You start this one off.
Oh, yeah, I can start this off. So as Nathan alluded to, our backgrounds are definitely not very normal. So I think both of us have been working since quite a young age. For me personally, I had my first business when I was very young, sort of 12 or so. And from there, I started a number of different businesses right the way through to uni. In my final year of uni, I started working for Rocketlab as a guidance, navigation, and control engineer. So I was responsible for what's called a hardware simulator, essentially a big simulator for the rocket. And that was my first job working for someone else. I joined Rocketlab when it was pretty new. It was less than 50 when I started, and I was with Rocketlab right through to about 600 employees. So that was well before we'd launched anything, to over 10 orbital launches. So that was where I really got my startup roots. I then moved to All Goods, which was another startup here in New Zealand, and that was with Nathan. And it was All Goods that actually led us to Partly. So I won't go into that. I'll pass him.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we're both sort of similar in that. Well, we obviously had a bit of an odd upbringing. I also, I suppose, sort of was interested in doing things myself and not necessarily working for other people. I don't think I've really enjoyed my experiences working with other people at a young age, which is maybe part of the reason why I ended up down this business route. I grew up for my teenage years in Indonesia, and that's where I started getting very interested in languages and was reasonably good at it. So I started doing translation and interpreting as a teenager, and right through university, which eventually led me to China, studying and then working over there. And that's where I got my entrepreneurial bug, I guess you could say, was just simply that experience. I mean, obviously I'd had a different experience in a different culture and environment as a teenager, but then further as an adult and kind of starting into that working life and experiencing China, where in some areas they were so much more advanced than what I had experienced in New Zealand. And in some areas, of course, not. But simply seeing at that age where I think my mind was extremely blind ambition sort of leads you to seeing endless opportunities. I guess you could sort of see from that perspective. So it was through there, seeing all of these different opportunities and different ways of doing technology and different ways of interacting with software and e-commerce at the time was of a particular interest, and then taking that back into New Zealand. And the one person who I knew in my life who had been always very entrepreneurial and interested in business and technology and these sorts of things was Levi. So that's how we both together throughout that period had always been keeping in touch, and we ended up starting that business together.
Okay, fantastic. That's a really interesting, I guess, diverse background from both of you. So it's great to see that you came together in the end for Partly. Sinead, do you have a question?
So moving forward, I guess, to the point where you had that market validation and some kind of early stage customers, how did you guys decide to move into the business and transition? Levi, you mentioned you're at Rocketlab, so how did you transition from your full-time permanent role into Partly, and when did you kind of know that it was right?
Yeah, good question. So there were kind of two layers to this. We had All Goods, which was a different startup between. So actually at the time, I wasn't willing to commit to the startup to All Goods full time. So I would work 3 days a week in Auckland for Rocketlab, and then I would work 4 days a week down here in Christchurch and kind of just do that on cycle. And that kind of let us keep the company running. We were able to kind of bootstrap it or fund it. But I was able to continue working at Rocketlab. Now, All Goods was a separate business, as I mentioned, designed to simplify things and allow SMBs to sell online really easily. And I guess the main reason I wasn't willing to commit to it was I enjoyed Rocketlab. It was a very, very exciting company to work for. And we really had very little traction and almost no revenue. So it was hard to say, now is the time to commit to this. In hindsight, I should have committed much earlier. And that's advice I always give people now. Commit to these things earlier, take more risk. But at the time, it wasn't clear. And so I ended up doing that for nearly 2 years, actually. So the whole team in Christchurch would work offset days. They'd work Wednesday through to Sunday and take Monday and Tuesday off.
Yeah.
And then I would work Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday in Auckland so that we could, have most overlap.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I can imagine you'd have a few late nights.
Yes. Yeah. No, it was very exciting. It was fun, but it was definitely very, very hard work. So it was actually all of the stats and a lot of the learnings that we got from All Goods that led us to Partly. We eventually shut down All Goods, which was a very difficult decision.
Okay.
Fantastic. So obviously you guys have raised a pretty impressive round recently. Would you like to talk us through that journey of getting to that point where, going through those funding rounds, had you been through rounds before? Maybe a little bit on that journey, because I think that's always really interesting to hear everyone's different perspective on how they went through that.
For sure, absolutely. So our fundraising journey was a bit unusual as well. Now, we raised a pre-seed round from Blackbird, a $1.7 million pre-seed round. It was this time last year.
No,
right?
It was late 2019. 2020.
Late 2020. Yeah.
Late 2020.
Maybe 18 months ago. And that was off the back of kind of early customer traction, a very global focus, and a really, really hard problem. It was a fundamental problem. So we'd just made the decision to move on from All Goods. We were in the process of shutting All Goods down. We built a very, very early MVP for Partly, and we had a very small number of customers using it. The customers that were using it really liked it. We knew from All Goods that those customers really wanted what we had. It was a deep and painful problem we were solving. And we actually did a practice pitch at an event here in Christchurch. It was the first time we'd pitched. We were actually still editing the slides while I was pitching it, and Blackbird and another investor were on the call, and pretty much after the practice pitch, both Blackbird and this other investor got in contact with us, and we ended up kind of negotiating with the two and took that 1.7 million at a six point something million dollar valuation.
USD.
Yeah, so that was very unusual in that we didn't ever really formally pitch for that first round, but we had a really strong product in hindsight, and we had really good product market fit. We had a good kind of customer, very early customer base, and most importantly, it was a deep fundamental problem, and we had a global vision.
I think I think the team at the time had a big part of the ability to raise that round. Like we had to that date a fair amount of experience in scaling at least the early sort of stages of a startup. We'd been together as a team for a number of years by that point, and had sort of made a fair amount of mistakes already. So I think that probably had a fair amount to do with that as well.
Oh, and how just on that, how has Partly changed as a product from what your initial idea and what you thought you were going to be offering was to kind of where you are now?
Well, it's barely recognizable now. In all honesty, the first product was about as MVP as you can get. It was a framework, So from that early product, it has completely changed. We've redesigned everything. We've rewritten everything. There are some concepts that are similar, but other than that, it's totally different. The strategy and vision for the business has probably grown. It was already enormous. Half of the decision to move from All Goods to Partly was the global vision. We really wanted to do something meaningful on the global stage. But it's grown even bigger than that since. I think we're really focused on this enabling infrastructure and trying to disrupt a very, very large industry. And I think our product has changed with that. We're now far more focused on building enabling infrastructure. We work with very, very large businesses now, Fortune 500 companies in Europe and in America to try and enable the digitalization of the industry, as opposed to building specific tools within the industry.
And how did that decision come about, moving from that sort of marketplace offering to more of a SaaS model? Was that an easy decision? Is it something that happened naturally? Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, it wasn't an easy decision, but I think after talking to enough customers and looking at enough data, we realized it was very clearly the right decision. Now, the reason it's the right decision is in this particular industry, parts and vehicles, a part only fits a very specific set of vehicles, which means that in marketplace lingo, the liquidity problem is very, very hard. You've got to have a huge amount of supply before it's really useful for buyers. And it was clear that just wasn't going to happen being focused on a marketplace. It was also clear that there were more fundamental problems. The data was completely unstructured. Auto parts businesses just couldn't sell online. So we realized we could solve the more fundamental problem. There is a high chance that we'll be supporting a large number of businesses selling their parts online in the future, but we don't mind being the supporting infrastructure.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. Moving certainly from pivoting the entire business. That was a big decision that I wouldn't say it felt natural, but it was, as Levi said, being very honest with the data, being very honest with the customers that we had. But then, as we've alluded to before, the business has changed and evolved significantly since those early days to where we are now. And I think that process has felt very natural. and really, yeah, growing the vision and solving the more fundamental problems, as opposed to shying away from those fundamental problems and kind of building band-aid solutions on top of them. Really diving in deep to solve the most painful problems that our customers were facing.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Just a quick question on COVID. Is that something that has affected the business at all? You may not have been affected like some other businesses. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think, to be completely honest, COVID hasn't affected us much. I mean, certainly not compared to most physical businesses or any business that requires a physical presence. So if anything, it's probably driven more of these businesses online. To date, we've done very little outbound marketing. Most of these customers are coming to us, and a big driver for that seems to be these companies realizing they need to be online. They need to be selling parts online. They need to be embracing e-commerce. And so I think, if anything, it's probably actually increased the number of customers that are coming to us. There were some times during the first few lockdowns that were a bit difficult. We weren't well set up to sell to work remote, but we certainly can't complain compared to other companies. It was a minor inconvenience in reality.
Perfect.
So what does future growth look like for you? And also, where does New Zealand sit relative to the rest of the world, with where you're going?
Yeah, so it's two questions there. On the growth side of things, we're barely even at the starting line. We've just raised that other, as you mentioned, that $3.7 million round to give us a bit more fuel. And most of that is still going into the engineering teams, to R&D, to building out this data structure. It's really very, very hard problem. Now, we're targeting just over 20% monthly revenue growth throughout this year. So we've sustained that through the last half of last year, and we're on track to kind of sustain it through this year. So that's really exciting. Certainly, if we can sustain that, we'll be very, very pleased. And we're continuing to hire. So we've gone from 9 people, this time last year, to 32 now. And I think we're going to be continuing to grow throughout the year as we approach our Series A. So we'll be looking to raise a fairly substantial Series A somewhere around the end of this year. Yeah.
Super exciting.
It is super exciting. I think for us, New Zealand is a particularly difficult market in our industry, just when it comes to sort of the car park and the cars that exist in the country. But it's been a really great place to sort of be operating from. On the world stage. I think it's been a good, people have positive views towards the country in general. Within our industry, or within how we position our business, and part of our mission is sort of being a bit more of a neutral, independent sort of third party kind of positioning that we take. And certainly New Zealand is not quite Switzerland, but somewhere along those lines, which I think has also been beneficial for us. So we've been able to really operate globally from day one. Our first few customers and have predominantly been in sort of Europe and Eastern Europe, but also till today, really truly globally, probably spread across maybe 30, 40 different countries now. Yeah, that's right. Less than 3% of our customers are here in New Zealand. The vast majority are in Europe and the States. And certainly once you calibrate to the scale that Europe operates at, or the rest of the world operate at, it really just makes so much more sense to focus on these bigger markets if you're solving a fundamental problem.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I think that probably answers Prayag's question, which was, Levi, why so many clocks on the wall behind you? I think that makes sense with the different time zones. So yeah, if you do have a question, please pop it in the Q&A and we will get to it. So on your journey so far, can you tell me maybe what has been the biggest challenge that you've faced and how you've gotten through that?
Oh, goodness gracious. How to pick the biggest. I feel like there's a big challenge and existential crisis every week, but
finding product market fit.
Yeah.
That's the biggest challenge.
Biggest challenge, yeah, is always finding product market fit. So I actually think the biggest challenge for us was making the decision to shut down all goods and focus exclusively on Partly. That was the biggest challenge because we didn't have product market fit. We had very little data and we had a moderately successful company. So it felt like if we just kept pushing or we just kept trying this new growth hack, we would build it into this really exceptional business. And so it was really hard. It took us months of debating and looking at first principles, fundamentals, to just make the decision to shut down that business we'd spent 3 years of our lives on. I'd put all my money into. Everyone else was working for free, so weren't earning anything. We were living in a garage in a caravan. And so we were just incredibly emotionally attached to this company. We didn't want to see it fail. Our reputations were on the line. There's all of these things. And we essentially decided that we were going to shut it down and try something completely new, unproven. And I think if it had been a clear failure, that would have been much easier. But because it was moderately successful, it was, I think, the most difficult decision was shutting it down, making that pivot. From that point on, there have been dozens of other very hard decisions. I remember times where we accidentally destroyed a customer's inventory and they were obviously incredibly unhappy. They were, threatening to sue us, and it took us a long time to kind of fix everything up and make them happy again. But there were some very stressful times when we made those, some pretty big mistakes.
With that, deciding to shut down that part and then sort of relaunch as something else, was everyone on the team supportive of that decision? Like Nathan, how did you feel about that one? Were you on board with that, or did that cause a little bit of tension?
I would probably say that I was probably the hardest to come around to the decision, probably the most conservative to eventually get on board. But as Levi said, like it wasn't a decision that happened overnight. It was months of really debating and looking at the numbers and then deciding, well, if we're going to move on to something else, what is that going to look like? We had the opportunity to have a fair amount of data, and we were in a good position to have experience, working alongside thousands of businesses by that point. And it gave us a lot of insight into a number of problems, but there was a very clear decision by the end of those months of debate as to where we were going to go. But yeah, it was, I totally agree. It was probably the hardest decision to make in the business to date. It was, just to reiterate exactly what Levi said, like when you've put 3 years of your life, your reputation, your money, your sleep that you've lost, it was hard. But we made it, and I think it was the right decision, obviously, in hindsight.
Fantastic.
I have a quick question about your how the getting the investors on board. How's that helped, and the advice they've been giving you, and how has that kind of changed the game for you?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So I think it wasn't obvious how useful it would be at the start. We originally we weren't planning on going for a sort of a super VC funded route. We thought that we could bootstrap it. It was only when we decided to go really global, it was clear that we needed to use a VC funded strategy. And it was very intentional. We made the decision to go VC funded for a reason. Now, looking back, that was absolutely the right decision. It really gave us a far more global perspective on things. We've been connected with some really key people, key businesses that have let us scale, maybe 2x faster, really significant. And I also think in hindsight, the quality of the VC is really, really important. When we were raising, we had a number of really good options and ended up going with Blackbird as a lead. And that was a very, very good decision because their network, their connections within Australia has helped us scale enormously. And having Samantha on our board it's been strategically hugely valuable. She's seen these types of things before. She knows how startups scale, and it's surprising how concisely she can spot problems with your thinking and kind of point you in a different direction.
Yeah, we actually hosted Samantha on our at our previous event, and she's amazing.
Yeah, she is.
Yeah, no, I'm just to add on to that, I think the VC side of things, like it's been absolutely the right route for our company to go down, and the biggest thing for us is really having VCs that are totally 100% aligned with the vision that we have. It's a very long-term vision, and naturally VCs are generally very long-term thinking. So having a very, very supportive investors that are totally on board with what we're going out to achieve. And again, like when we're still talking about the things that we're going out to achieve, we're talking about what we want to have achieved in 10 or 15 years time. So it's sort of outside of the VC world. A lot of the time it's you come across as crazy, or especially in New Zealand, maybe too ambitious. But all of the VCs and investors that we've managed to welcome onto our cap table have been incredibly supportive, added value where needed, and have not brought any unwanted advice at all. It's been an incredibly valuable path that we've gone onto, and enabled us to scale much faster than 2x in all aspects, really, both personally and both in the team as well, in terms of the talent that we've attracted and managed to bring on, in terms of the customers, and also in terms of just like scaling the culture and the advice and the things like that as well.
Okay, fantastic. We've got a question here from Aaron. Aaron would like to know what gave you the courage and confidence as leaders to go all in with Partly?
Good question. An interesting question. There's probably two different aspects to that for me. Number one was probably our upbringing. I actually, personally, I didn't think I was very employable. As strange as that sounds in hindsight, I really didn't think I was going to be employable. And so I thought my only option was going to be to build my own company. So that certainly fed into the ambition thing. I think the second thing was Rocketlab. Being part of Rocketlab early on and building a rocket here in New Zealand that launches satellites into space really made me realize anything is possible with enough effort and a good enough team, and also realizing what we can do from here in New Zealand. Rocketlab was the second private company in the world to put something in space, and we did it with 100 people from Auckland. So I think that perspective really changed how I looked at things. And then the other related piece is seeing All Goods and realizing how small New Zealand was relative to the rest of the world. We created an app once here in New Zealand, and we made it available globally just as a side thought. And we spent, I don't know, a huge amount of time, money and effort advertising it in New Zealand, launched it, and 50% of our downloads came from the US because they happened to find it in the App Store, versus all of our time and energy marketing it in New Zealand. And it just really made us realize how big the rest of the world was compared to New Zealand. So, yeah.
There's just a question in the chat. Stephen S would like to know what All Goods was and kind of like what the problem that you were solving with All Goods.
Yeah. The problem we were solving with All Goods was essentially a simpler, easy way to get inventory online. Now, we were also indirectly competing with TradeMe, which was a terrible idea in hindsight, and there have been about 500 other companies that have tried to compete with TradeMe. Now, we kind of knew this, and we weren't intentionally competing with TradeMe for a very long time, but it's just the way it played out. When you're selling things online as a marketplace, unless you are focused on a specific vertical, you're probably going to lose to a big player like TradeMe. So anyway, at its core, that's what it was. It was a tool designed to make it really easy for small to medium businesses to get their inventory online.
Question here from Will. How have you managed to create the technology you've needed for the product? Is it an area of your personal expertise, or have you brought on new talent to bridge the gap between the product vision and implementation?
Yeah, cool. Good question as well. It's been extremely difficult. It is my own personal passion, I guess. I was an engineer at Rocketlab. I was building as I said, the simulator for the guidance navigation control systems. And so it set me up quite well. I have quite a strong technical background. These days, I don't do much technical work, and rightly so. Our team are all better than I am. On that note, we have really focused on bringing on exceptional engineers. We didn't take on really any interns, any grads, and over half of our team are ex-CTOs or VPs from other companies who are, just good senior engineers. So I think we really focused on very high quality, very, very talented people. And we have very, very difficult problems to solve. So it naturally means it's quite a fun environment for engineers to work in. Our largest customer has 350 million monthly active users. And when you're trying to solve a problem at that scale from here in New Zealand, you can't build things on a New Zealand scale. And as a result, we've needed to bring on these really good engineers, but also it's a real interesting, challenging environment. And engineers love that. Well, as an engineer, I loved it anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, there was a question, but it's just gone away. Oh no, here we go. Jay is wondering, how did you handle the legal side of things in your early days? Did you hire your own lawyer, or obviously it can be quite costly with lawyers in those early days. So how did you approach that?
Yeah,
there's been a number of things there. It's been I would say a progressive journey from really bootstrapping, what do they call it, Bushman law, to probably reasonably sophisticated legal work that we have done today. Starting off, really, it's using all of the free resources out there, using all of the templates, using connections of lawyer friends to sort of do some pro bono work on the side for us. But as things progress, we've done a lot of legal work to date, whether it's in the protection of IP to really good internal structures to scalable company legal structures as we scale throughout the globe, and all sorts of different areas. It's an interesting question because absolutely the legal side of things is expensive. So to start, it's not just on the legal side of things, but we were extremely scrappy for the first sort of 3-4 years of the business, just extremely frugal in the way that we spent money. Looking back on it, I don't know how we managed to do some of the things that we did, or even just personally live for those periods of times, and maybe it was sort of just a factor of being young and had never experienced sort of having the opportunity to get the good tools, or to kind of experience that side of things. But yeah, so it sort of scaled and throughout the journey. As soon as we'd got onto that VC funding route, obviously you have to start being a lot more serious and a lot more verbose in your legal setup. So at that point, I think we started being forced to spend a bit more on legal fees.
Another question from Jay: how did you go ahead with securing your brand around the world? Jay says, we are a startup and are wondering if we should be looking at doing so sooner rather than later. We started by securing it simply in New Zealand, and I just did that myself. If you're doing it in New Zealand, I think that most startup founders can figure out that out themselves. If you're starting to do it around the world, it really depends on the product as to whether you want to, what level of IP protection that you're wanting to go into. We simply secured trademarks and also look at a number of other sort of protection areas, even at this point, but I wouldn't spend significant amounts too early on. It really depends on the stage. It does take quite a while. It's quite a process to secure trademarks and patents and those sorts of things. So start thinking about it early. But if it's going to be like a really significant expense in the business, I wouldn't be spending that money in markets that you're not necessarily going to be operating in for the next 6 months too early.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's certainly, it wouldn't have made sense for us to do it early. It would have been a big distraction. We did buy the partly.com domain name, and that was very expensive. And in hindsight, that was the right decision.
Yeah.
But outside of owning the domain name, or at least being the global authority for whatever your brand name is, I think the legal, the patent side of things probably would come second to that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I've got a quick question about the team. So how have you found, so you mentioned, you're dealing with customers that have 350 mil MAUs, and there's not a lot of people in New Zealand that have had experience scaling products that are that big. So what are you kind of looking for when you are growing your team, and how have you found it? And if there was someone that was, really keen to join Partly, what kind of insight could you give them?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. It has been a challenge finding people who are comfortable with that scale, that level of, scale essentially. I think there are a few things that we look for. Number one is a real willingness to understand things from first principles. So we have to figure out so much of this on our own. In a lot of cases, there aren't playbooks, and we're unlike a lot of startups in that we actually have to solve the problems well. There's, all goods, we hacked a lot of things. It was an MVP. We would write quick and dirty code to get something out within 2 hours, and it worked. So this isn't the case for the amount of data and the scale that we're dealing with. So we're really looking for people that enjoy solving hard problems, that think from first principles. We also look for people who've got experience at larger international companies. So some of our engineers would be ex-Amazon, ex-Google, Sony Ericsson, some of these large international companies. And that often gives them a bit more context when they're working on these hard data problems. But we found that that's not the most important thing. Really, the most important thing is that deep understanding from first principles and willingness to just solve these hard problems, and mostly we just figure it out.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of on the skills and experience side of things, but you know, we've also got obviously our company values and certain culture, and I guess that's been recent got a bit of flack, you know, in the startup world for looking for cultural fit, but you know, for us it really means sort of these values of being very ambitious, of you know, assuming the best intentions about each other, of you know, the way that you approach problems, you know, as Levi said, from first principles, and sort of optimizing for the most impactful result, as opposed to, you know, what might be the most comprehensive or might be the easiest result, and you know, and other areas around, you know, just acting like an owner. You know, everyone in our business is an owner, and so you know, there's all of these sort of behaviors and attitudes that obviously are just incredibly important, and we don't hire anyone who doesn't fit with those attitudes, and you know, there's a whole bunch of people out there that have fantastic experience and fantastic skills, but most people just full stop are not suited to working at a startup. It's a very exciting environment, but it's different from, it's just totally different from working at some larger, more established corporate company or something like that. So I think, you know, we definitely go into those, you know, the hiring sort of process of really being aware that most people are not going to be suited, and it's really is a small subset of people who are super ambitious and also have some crazy skills.
Okay, on the note, or continuing on that, with the culture within your team, are all your team members in New Zealand? Are they all in Christchurch? And if they're not, how do you maintain their culture if you do have, you know, team members out of Christchurch or even out of New Zealand?
It's a great question, actually. We've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And the short answer to this is most of our team are here in Christchurch for this reason. We felt we couldn't get this deep culture that we thought was so important without having the majority of the team at least able to visit the office regularly. People work from home a lot here in Christchurch, but it's really important for us that we have get-togethers, we do off-sites, we do things together as a team, and people come into the office regularly to kind of learn through osmosis and just meet everyone in person. So we've got four or five people outside of Christchurch, and then the rest, 20-something, 26, 27 are all based here in Christchurch.
Oh, wow.
Now that's likely not to continue at scale. You know, right. we started very early to build the infrastructure and able to support you know, having more and more staff remote, and already we're seeing that today, and there's a higher percentage of staff being outside of Christchurch. So really building that infrastructure and the strong virtual culture and those sorts of things has been important, and that's just throughout how we do meetings. It's throughout how we communicate with each other through Slack and other things, how we document things. You know, we use Notion for all of our internal docs and reiterating cultural principles, and through how we onboard staff, even if they're remote, and all of these sorts of things. But you know, as Levi said, like we've managed to hire incredibly talented people. You know, locally, not all of them were local. You know, we've had quite a number of people who've moved to Christchurch to work for Partly, and so far, you know, being able to attract amazing talent to come in and work locally in the city and in the office has been absolutely fantastic.
Amazing. Yeah, I was just going to touch on that. You know, how difficult has it been to attract great staff in, you know, a relatively small city like Christchurch. Is
Depends on the day that you ask us, I think. At times it has felt incredibly difficult. I know there's a lot of companies out there in New Zealand that really struggle for finding talent, and sometimes that's us as well. But at the end of the day, I think where we are now, and we look back over the past few years of getting talent, and I think we've been we've done well. We've managed to assemble we certainly think we've got the best team in New Zealand. It comes across, don't want to come across as arrogant, but we're very, very proud of the team that we've built and the people that we've managed to attract into the business.
Oh, brilliant. That's great to hear.
There's another question here. Anonymous asks, where did the idea for Partly come from, and what was the first indication that Partly was an idea worth committing 100% to?
Yeah, another very good question. So I think that goes right back to my childhood. As Nathan said right at the start, I spent a lot of my time fixing things. So it wasn't just electronics. I fixed tractors, I fixed cars. And one of the biggest problems that we faced doing that, the few years I was doing that, was finding parts. So I think very early on, at least for me personally, I was very aware of the problem. Now, I thought that it was just a New Zealand problem. We're an island off the coast of Australia. No, we're a little island, and maybe it's just we haven't got the systems in place. When we were running All Goods, we saw really interesting data. So nearly 80% of our purchases were coming from outside of New Zealand in the automotive parts category. And that was compared to 5% in the other categories. It was, over nearly 2 orders of magnitude different, right? Or 20 times difference. On top of that, the average order value was very high. The organic conversion rate was high. And because I'd experienced the problem when I was younger, it was quite obvious to me personally that this was a problem that should be solved. It was once we realized the problem was global that we decided to commit to it 100%. And it was also, I think, the fact that it was a global problem that really made us decide shutting down All Goods was the right decision, because we didn't want to spend the rest of our lives, we didn't want to do our lives work, so to speak, working on this business that couldn't scale outside of New Zealand. Whereas if we were focused on Partly, the problem was very clear. It was obviously painful based on my experience, based on the data we saw at All Goods, and it was global. So I think that's where we decided it was a big problem and why we decided to focus on 100%.
Okay. Another great question from Jay. How did you compensate your team in the very early days? By paying them or giving them shares in the company? Have you considered ESOPs at all? If yes, then at what point?
Yes, it is a good question. So in the early days, everyone had shares. Well, in the early days, everyone had quite a lot of shares, and no one was paid anything, or practically nothing. Later on, we started paying kind of a combination of ESOPs, employee stock options. And we give everyone in the company stock options now, or ESOPs. Now, that's been critical. That's been so critical because we're all aligned on the same thing. It really helps people act like owners because they literally are owners. And it's meant that when we raised more money, so obviously that first round we were at $7 or $8 million valuation, and so we had new starters that might have $30, $40, $50,000 worth of shares. Once we closed our last round, which was 8 months later, we closed another round valued at 50 million, and so their stocks are worth 200, 300,000, and so it's quite a low cost for us in the big scheme of things, considering everyone is bought in, and it really makes us feel good as well because we know that everyone's benefiting from the company's success. So I highly recommend ESOPs. I wouldn't do it any other way. And nowadays we try and be really generous when it comes to ESOPs. So we pay like a market rate salary and ESOPs to really make it clear that we care and that we're all aligned.
Was that something that you decided right at the beginning, or is that something that, it came more out of necessity? You said you didn't pay people very much at the beginning. And what was the decision making behind that?
Yeah, we didn't do it early on at All Goods, just because I think we were thinking a lot smaller. We wanted to bootstrap. We did it from day one at Partly, and that was very intentional. It was intentional because we just felt it was fair and reasonable with this exceptional team. We wanted them all to be aligned, and we wanted them to succeed when we succeeded. So we wanted to do that right from the start.
I think it was about the culture we wanted to build, like acting like an owner as a very core value and principle that we really really want to instill in our culture. We felt that we couldn't honestly instill that culture unless people actually were owners of the business, and that means from new grads to senior and executives in the business. Going back to the early days, as I said before, like those first 2-3 years were incredibly difficult in terms of living off of savings and things like that. But as a founding team, obviously it's predominantly equity that you're working for. But as soon as we went down that VC route, things start becoming a lot more. You're on a certain track. You're either growing at unnatural rates, or you're failing, essentially. So at that point, ensuring that everyone was an owner in the business became an important thing that we wanted to do.
Oh, I feel like we need to do a whole startup grind session on employee share options, because this does come up a lot, and I think it's obviously really important too. Rosie, do you think we've got time for one last question? I know we're at time, but I've got one.
Let's go to what your plans are for the future. You're already in other countries. Is it what's next? Is it world domination? What do you see happening over the next, say, 12 to 24 months?
Yeah. There is a few different things that we're focused on over the next 12 to 24 months. So we have a very wide distribution customers. We don't have a lot of customers in each country. If anything, the next 12 months will be more focused. So we'll be focusing more heavily on Eastern Europe and Australasia. Now, in terms of big goals for us, we're from a fundraising point of view, we're working towards a Series A end of this year. From a product perspective, we're working to solve this problem in quite a fundamental way. So we're working with larger and larger businesses. We want to start powering more of the world's largest marketplaces. We want to be powering the likes of eBay, the likes of Amazon globally. And we want to be working with large public companies when it comes to the distribution networks and the manufacturers. So really for us, we're starting to think more about these really big customers and how we help build a world-class product for them, how we help them sell to their customers. And really that's going to be our number one focus. Now, for us, we kind of structure that around what we call customer love, tracking how many customers love us. And that's the most important thing as opposed to a large percentage of customers. We're really just focusing on doing an exceptional job, building a world-class product for those customers. And then hopefully that'll naturally set us up well for a free Series A end of this year.
That's really exciting. So if people have any questions that we haven't gotten around to today, what's the best way for them to reach out to you, to flick you through those questions, or to follow you to keep up with your progress? Is that LinkedIn? Is that Twitter? Where can they find you?
LinkedIn. Yeah, I think LinkedIn's the best place to follow us. We're reasonably active there.
Brilliant.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, I think that's time, but before we conclude, I just want to thank our sponsors, who we obviously wouldn't be here without tonight. So we've got Talent Army, Cultivate, AWS, Stripe, and Our Closet. And the other cool thing is Stripe is offering our Startup Grind community members access to 15 grand worth of waived Stripe fees for card transactions. And also Amazon's has a super awesome offer where they are giving the Startup Grind community up to it's $5,000 USD worth of Amazon promotional credit. So if anyone's really interested in that, just get in touch with us and I can give you the codes and the links to enable it.
Brilliant. There's some fantastic offers. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you for all those questions. We really appreciate you being here. And yeah, that was brilliant. Thanks so much.
Guys.
Cool. Thanks for having us.
Oh,
Cheers, guys.
See ya.